Easter Sunday in 1975 was like any other in Hamilton, Ohio. Children hunted for eggs, mothers made last-minute preparations for family dinners, and entire families were dressed in new clothes to attend morning church services. For the Ruppert family, the day started out happy. They worshipped together at an early service and then gathered at 635 Minor Avenue in Hamilton, a middle-class community about 30 miles from Cincinnati. But what happened that afternoon, March 30th, 1975, went down as the deadliest shooting to ever occur in a private home in American history. And it left a grim and troubling haunting behind. Our episodes deal with serious and often distressing incidents. If at any time you feel like you need support, please contact your local crisis centre. This episode discusses mass murder. Some of the victims were children, and therefore may be graphic and upsetting. It may not be suitable for all listeners. Listener discretion is advised. James Urban Ruppert was born on March 29, 1934. He was reported to have had a troubled life. His mother, Charity, had told him that she would have preferred to have a daughter as her second child. His father, Leonard, also had a violent temper and held little affection for his two sons. Leonard died in 1946 from tuberculosis at the age of 37, when James and his brother, Leonard Jr., were aged 12 and 14 respectively. Leonard Jr. became the father figure of the family and constantly picked on James during their upbringing, often taunting him. At 16, James was so dissatisfied with his home life that he ran away and attempted to commit suicide by hanging himself with a sheet. He was unsuccessful and returned home. As an adult, James stood at 5'6" and weighed 135 pounds. He was described as a modest, bookish, and helpful man who was unremarkable and quiet. In addition, he had no police record. By 1975, James Ruppert was envious of his older brother's successful job and family. James himself had dropped out of college after 2 years, then trained as a draftsman, although by 1975 he was unemployed, unmarried, and was still living at home with his mother. In contrast, his older brother, Leonard Jr., had earned a degree in electrical engineering, owned his own home in the city of Fairfield, and to make matters worse, had married one of the few girlfriends James had ever had, with whom he had 8 children. Charity was frustrated with James's inability to hold a steady job and his constant drinking. She had threatened to evict him from her home on more than one occasion. James also owed his mother and brother money, having lost much of what little cash he had in the 1973 and 74 stock market crash. James Ruppert appeared to live a normal life, but a close look at his biography reveals that he actually led a life of frustration. When James was a young boy, the Rupperts lived in a long barn-like structure which lacked indoor plumbing and running water. His father raised chickens and squabs in the rear of the house. At the same time in his life, James began to suffer from a case of asthma, an allergy to dust and feathers, which left him sickly and limited many of his physical activities for the rest of his life. James Ruppert simply couldn't perform like other children his age. He walked hunched over from illness, so sickly that he was not permitted to take gym at school or to play sports with the neighbourhood kids. Even without asthma, his frail appearance and short stature could have severely limited his success in competitive sports. James was regarded as a sissy by the other kids in the neighbourhood. He remembered being a shy, introverted child who from his earliest years in school was routinely teased by other children and had few, if any, friends. Until his junior year in high school, James remained pretty much a loner, avoiding extracurricular activities, rarely attending ball games or going to dances, and never dating girls. The events of childhood had a lasting effect. Try as he did, James Ruppert was impotent. He was never able to have sexual relations with a woman, except as they occurred in his rich fantasy life. James's memory of his father was that of a frustrated, unsuccessful man who displayed a violent temper and little affection for his younger son. James also thought that his father had had no confidence in him, recalling his father's warnings that he would not be capable of holding a job or supporting himself as an adult. It didn't help that James's 5'11", 37-year-old father died of complications from tuberculosis when James was only 12 years old, forcing him to assume adult responsibilities from an early age. James Ruppert told psychiatrists that after his father's death, his mother would beat and taunt him and would encourage his brother Leonard to do the same. From James's viewpoint, his mother had made very clear to him that his presence was a mistake, that she had wanted a girl, not another boy in the family. At the age of 16, things at home got so bad that James ran away and later attempted suicide by hanging himself with a sheet. Though he failed in this attempt, the thought of suicide was something that stayed with James for decades to come. James's mother showered love on her older son, who became a constant reminder to James of his own inadequacies. Leonard Jr. was the male head of the household after his father's death, whereas James always felt like an outcast in his own family. Leonard played sports while James sat on the sidelines. James was very conscious of being 5 inches shorter than his brother. James's math and science teachers always compared him with his older brother, whose grades in the same classes had been superior. Leonard Jr. had graduated from night school with a degree in electrical engineering, whereas James flunked out of college after 2 years. Leonard Jr. became a successful engineer with General Electrics, whereas brother James went from job to job. Leonard Jr. was happily married with 8 children, whereas James never married and continued to live with his mother. By his own standards, James was as much a failure as his brother Leonard was a success. To make matters worse, Leonard Jr. was, at least in his younger brother's mind, a vicious sadist and torturer. In a word, he was the enemy. Going back to early childhood, James still remembered his brother locking him in closets, tying him with rope, beating him with a hose, and sitting on his head until he screamed out loud. The image only worsened over time, and by James's 30th birthday, he was just beginning to see Leonard as the major figure in what he believed to be an emerging conspiracy against him. The paranoia really escalated in 1965 when the Hamilton Police Department determined that James had made an obscene phone call to an employee of the local public library where James spent much of his free time. Although admitting making the call, James was convinced that his brother and his mother were attempting to discredit him by informing everyone of his transgression and reporting to the FBI that he was a communist and homosexual. He also believed that the FBI was tapping his telephone, not only at home, but also in the restaurants and bars he happened to visit. Over the years, he felt the intrusion of the FBI into his personal life continued to grow. Other groups were also implicated by James in the plot to sabotage his career, his social contacts, and his car. By 1975, he told psychiatrists of being followed by the State Highway Patrol, the local sheriff's department, private detectives, and the Hamilton Police, all of which were never proven. On March 29th, James's birthday, witnesses later reported seeing him shooting at cans with a .357 Magnum along the banks of the Great Miami River in Hamilton. He went out later that night, and at the 19th hole cocktail lounge, he talked with employee Wanda Bishop. She later recalled that James seemed deeply depressed and talked about his mother's demands on him and her threatened eviction. He said that he needed to solve the problem. He left the bar at 11 p.m. that night. He later returned, and when asked if he had solved his problem, he replied, "No, not yet." He stayed until the bar closed at 2:30 a.m. The scene of the mass slaying was the house which James and his mother shared. A small, two-storey, two-tone wood frame structure situated on a quiet, tree-lined residential street in Hamilton. The occasion was Easter Sunday, 1975, the day after James's 41st birthday. James's ailing 65-year-old mother, Charity, had invited the entire clan to the house. Her two sons, James and Leonard's family, including his wife Alma, and their 8 children, ranging in age from 4 to 17. The day began happily enough. Shortly after arriving, the members of Leonard Ruppert's family gathered together on the front lawn where they had an Easter egg hunt. Then they all went into the house for the yearly family reunion and dinner. Everyone mingled in the living room and kitchen. Everyone, that is, except Uncle James, who was on the second floor of the house making his final preparations. Charity Ruppert was fixing sandwiches at the kitchen range, while Leonard and his wife Alma sat together at the kitchen table. Their youngest child was in the bathroom. One of their daughters stood waiting her turn by the bathroom door, as the other 6 children played in the living room. Moments later, James Ruppert, gun enthusiast and crack marksman, walked calmly down the stairs carrying 3 revolvers and a rifle, which he immediately propped against the refrigerator door. With his back to the kitchen sink, James fired first at his brother Leonard, who fell backwards onto the floor. He then shot his sister-in-law Alma and his mother Charity, who lunged towards him in a last futile effort to save her family and her life. His nephew David and his nieces Teresa and Carol were also in the kitchen. James then rushed into the living room, where he killed his niece Anne and his 4 remaining nephews, Leonard III, Michael, Thomas and John. Before anyone had a chance to think, let alone escape, James had fired 31 shots, stopping only to reload. He killed each of his victims by first taking a disabling shot and then finishing them off with a shot to the head or heart. 10 of them were shot in the head at close range. 1 was shot in the chest. Nobody screamed and nobody ran. All of them were dead when James called the police some 3 hours later. "There's been a shooting here," he told the police over the phone. The massacre took less than 5 minutes to complete. When the police arrived, James was waiting for them just inside the front door. The police described the scene as a slaughterhouse. There was so much blood splashed about that it was dripping through the floorboards into the basement. To this day, stains can still be seen on the wood. The case of James Ruppert demonstrates in dramatic fashion that things aren't always what they seem to be. The 41-year-old resident of Hamilton, Ohio, hardly seemed likely to commit mass murder. He had no police record, and except for thick glasses and a small stature, was undistinguished in appearance. Even after he had brutally murdered 11 relatives, neighbours still recalled the 5'6" James as being a quiet and responsible member of this industrial community of some 63,000 people. Defence attorney Hugh Holbrook later said of James, "He's one of the kindest human beings I have ever met. He would do anything to help people." The police had a suspect, but no motive. James Ruppert was taken into custody and charged with 11 counts of aggravated murder. He refused to talk to the police about the killings and pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. Prosecutors believed that he planned to plead insanity and then, after being cured, would be released to inherit a $300,000 inheritance. The Ruppert murders and trial provoked what one local observer called a three-ring circus. For weeks following the tragic event, James Ruppert was the topic of conversation in town. Street sales of Hamilton's only daily newspaper doubled. Hundreds of neighbours congregated outside the Ruppert home, sometimes long past midnight. For 6 hours after the funerals, 400 cars carrying enthusiastic curiosity seekers, some in taxis, cruised past Arlington Memorial Gardens, where Ruppert's 11 victims were buried. During the trial, curious spectators began arriving early in the morning, some by 6 a.m, to wait outside the stone-faced, three-storey courthouse for one of the 60 seats in its warm, stuffy, third-floor courtroom. They ran for the stairs or elevator, hoping to beat the crowds to the courtroom door. Those who couldn't get seats stood around the walls of the courtroom or waited outside on benches in the corridors. For the duration of the proceedings, spectators in the hallway peered through the glass in the door, straining to get a glimpse of the defendant, who sat impassively throughout most of the trial. 1 year following the Easter Massacre, in 1976, the Ruppert home was unlocked to auction off its household possessions. The furniture, appliances, clothing, and odds and ends. Dozens of people came searching for bargains and bloodstains. They wound their way through the tiny backyard into the living room and kitchen and up the stairs into James's second-floor bedroom. As eyewitness Nancy Baker reported in the local paper, babies asleep in strollers, housewives in curlers, men smoking big cigars, all added to the carnival atmosphere. The Ruppert slayings provoked widespread anxiety throughout the Hamilton area. Townspeople had plenty of questions, but very few answers. Until the trial, the local newspapers did little more than report surface information, mostly about the who, what, and where, but little about the why. As though to fill the need for news, rumours were spread everywhere. Rumours which attempted to explain why the killings occurred and what effect they might have on the community. Psychiatrists report that grieving over the loss of a close relative or friend frequently begins with denial. Survivors reject the reality of a death until such time that they are psychologically ready to deal with it. Denial seems to be especially common in cases of murder where a large number of victims are involved. The enormity of the crime provoked widespread disbelief. How could only one person have killed all those people? Why didn't at least some of them escape? How could they have gone to the slaughter like lambs? The answer, of course, is that even the victims themselves couldn't believe what was about to happen. The body of one of the Ruppert children was found lying only a foot or so from the back door, which she apparently had managed to open slightly before being gunned down by her uncle. None of the other victims even came close. Murder by the hands of a family member, especially a son killing his mother, can be too much for the mind to fathom. What is more, the family is typically a closed unit in which conflicts and disagreements are kept from the prying ears and eyes of outsiders. Consequently, people who considered themselves to be familiar with the perpetrator and his victims responded in utter shock. The Ruppert family's friends and relatives couldn't believe it. James's uncle, Rufus Skinner, insisted that Jimmy and his brother Leonard were two close soldiers who did everything for their mother ever since their father died in 1946. Arthur Bauer said of his close friend James, "He's not violent at all. I can't believe he did it. How could anything like that happen?" A retired court stenographer, Mrs. Lucille Tabler, is an intelligent, active woman who lived in the Hamilton area for 70 years and knew the Rupperts as their family friend and neighbour. Mrs. Tabler denied what she couldn't understand. Upon hearing about the mass killings, she told reporters that she was thoroughly stunned. "I just don't believe it. Why would he want to do something like that? I wish I could talk to Jimmy." Even after being informed of James's undisputed confession, his presence at the scene of the crime, his fingerprints on the weapons, the victim's blood on his clothing, and his internally consistent recollections of the circumstances of the crime, Mrs. Tabler steadfastly refused to acknowledge that James Ruppert was a killer. 7 years later, she faithfully reconfirmed her confidence in the man she knew from childhood, visiting him in jail and defending his name among the locals. To this day, she asks, why was the whole world against the Ruppert family? A community can deny only so long after the occurrence of an extraordinary murder. As more and more information about the killings comes to public light, denial quickly turns into anger, and community members begin to look for someone or something to blame. For several months following the slayings, people in Hamilton were profoundly outraged. After all, there were 11 bloody bodies, 8 dead children, an entire family whose members had been completely wiped out in one fell swoop. Angry feelings towards James Ruppert sometimes became generalised in a free-floating sort of hostility which could have taken a dangerous turn. Members of the Donald Ruppert family were lucky to have escaped with their lives. The only Ruppert remaining in the Hamilton telephone directory. Though not related to the killer, Donald Ruppert's family was constantly harassed by townspeople for at least 6 months following the mass slayings. He finally decided to change his name for a period of time in order to avoid the dirty looks and obscene phone calls. According to Donald Ruppert, even those people who had known him well weren't really sure that he wasn't implicated in the crime. The people he worked with thought he was involved, and some wanted to know when he was going to get the money. At his June 1975 trial, James Ruppert entered a plea of insanity. Defence attorney H.J. Bressler argued that the very act Ruppert had committed was itself insane, that Ruppert had been insane for 10 years and that he was incapable of controlling his actions. Several expert witnesses agreed. Dr. Howard Sokolov described Ruppert as suffering from a paranoid psychotic state, one symptom of which was departure from reality in terms of thinking and behaviour. James, he suggested, was inclined to be excessively suspicious, jealous and angry. Defence psychiatrists also testified that James was absolutely obsessed with the belief that family members, the police and the FBI were involved in a long-standing conspiracy to persecute him. Dr. Philip Mihanic saw an even wider deficiency in James's personality. His ability to evaluate is impaired. His view of others is warped. he sees virtually no one in a kind light. Harvard psychiatrist Dr. Lester Grinspoon testified that James's deadly reaction may have been uncontrollable. Dr. Grinspoon said, "His ego was just completely overwhelmed by this rage, this suppressed rage which had been accumulating over some 10 years or more, actually since childhood, that there was no way in which he could avoid doing that act. In fact, if there had been more people in the house, they might have been killed also." Thus, the defence attempted to show that James Ruppert had gone totally berserk, that he was a victim of self-delusion who had acted from sheer impulse, the perpetrator of a brutal yet purposeless crime. But appearances can be deceiving, and the prosecution called 29 witnesses and presented 200 exhibits to develop an entirely different line of reasoning, namely that James Ruppert was as much a victim of self-delusion as Attila the Hun. Rather, he had carefully plotted and schemed to kill his entire family in order to collect more than $300,000, money tied up in life insurance, real estate, savings accounts, and other investments owned by his mother and his brother Leonard. Prosecuting attorney John Holcomb convincingly argued that James Ruppert's arrest and indictment were actually part of his master plan to enter a plea of not guilty by reason of temporary insanity, to be sent to Lima, a state mental hospital where he would eventually be declared sane and then walk out with $300,000 in his pocket. It was therefore reasonable to put forward an economic motive. Under Ohio law, James could not have inherited his victim's estate if he had been found guilty of murder. If, however, he had been declared innocent by reason of insanity, he would be able to receive everything. The family estate was a sizable amount by almost any standard. A prosecution witness and member of the real estate and probate committees of the American Bar Association testified that James Ruppert, as sole heir, stood to inherit the entire proceeds of his brother's life insurance, his mother's estate, and half of the property of his brother's children. Leonard's home was valued at $40,000. Property belonging to Leonard's family was assessed at $19,500, and his mother's home was worth $14,000. Leonard's life insurance coverage at General Electric was $62,000. His personal coverage was another $100,000. And Leonard invested in savings bonds, stocks, and mutual funds. His family also held savings accounts amounting to almost $30,000, which amounted to roughly $300,000, or $1.7 million in today's money. The defence sought to show that James had acted spontaneously, out of impulse, rather than deliberately by plan or scheme. But psychiatric testimony for the prosecution consistently empathised the plausibility of the profit motive. 2 psychiatrists and a psychologist testified that Ruppert was aware of what he was doing, knew right from wrong at the time of the slayings, and had the ability to resist his aggressive impulses. Dr. Charles Fuss, Jr., told the court he did not believe the slayings were carried out in a robot-like manner, yet there simply was no explanation for the killing of the sister-in-law and the children, since they had never been implicated by Ruppert in the alleged conspiracy against him. Butler County Coroner Dr. Garrett Boone called the Ruppert slayings pretty much of a deliberate execution. The 3-judge panel found Ruppert guilty on 11 counts of murder and sentenced him to life in prison on the 3rd of July 1975. A mistrial was declared because the 3-judge panel did not know if the ruling had to be unanimous or majority rule. The second trial began on July 23, 1975, and prosecutors revealed evidence involving the witnesses who had seen James Ruppert engaging in target practice, asking about silencers for his gun collection, and admitting that his mother's expectations were a problem that he needed to solve. In July 1975, Ruppert received 11 consecutive life sentences. On appeal, a new trial was granted in 1982. Defense attorney Hugh D. Holbrook, convinced his client was insane, personally funded the hiring of expert psychiatrists and psychologists from all over the country. In his retrial in 1982, a 3-judge panel found James guilty in the deaths of his first 2 victims, his mother and his brother, but not guilty by reason of insanity in the other 9 slayings. This decision suggests that James Ruppert intentionally killed his 2 immediate family members for some reason like revenge or money, and the others he killed almost as though he were an automaton, just because they were there. James Ruppert did have a frustrating life, but by itself, frustration simply isn't enough to explain James's criminal behaviour. He must also have had access to an effective weapon of mass destruction, a means of eliminating 11 people at once. This is why James's long-standing love affair with handguns is important to consider. Guns played an important role in James's life. They represented a manly activity that had been denied him as a sickly child with asthma, while other boys expressed their masculinity through competitive sports. Police Chief McNally described James Ruppert as a gun freak. He collected guns and passed his leisure time alone on the banks of the Great Miami River, shooting tin cans along the ground with his pistols. As recently as 2 days before the Easter Sunday massacre, witnesses recalled seeing Ruppert by the river, where he repeatedly fired his .357 Magnum revolver at tin cans. Moreover, a gun store employee claimed that a month or 2 before the Easter killings, James Ruppert had asked him where he could obtain a gun silencer. The implication was clear enough. James Ruppert may have been planning for some time to eliminate the members of his family. The exact time of death was yet to be decided, depending on the right events to raise his level of emotion and provide the perfect opportunity. Though James had endured a frustrating childhood and had access to guns, his crime depended on the operation of certain triggering events. In general, the triggering events may occur over a period of weeks or even months before a murder, or may occur immediately prior to it. In a number of family mass murders, the killer had given up trying to find a job and was deeply depressed about it. In other cases, a husband killed all the members of his family upon learning that his wife intended to obtain a divorce or shortly after the separation actually occurred. Psychiatrist Ruppert Fraser argues that family killers are frequently seen as gentle and passive individuals. They carefully sublimate their hostility towards family members so long as they receive some kind of reward in return, be it psychological or economical. But when such rewards are withdrawn, for example, when they are kicked out of the house or deprived of money, an explosion of anger is likely to occur. Family killers are also frequently loners who depend almost exclusively on the family to satisfy their emotional needs. The threat of separation by family members is a particularly painful and threatening event. In James Ruppert's case, the triggering mechanism consisted of certain precipitating events which just prior to Easter Sunday served to magnify the intensity of his negative feelings and to separate him further psychologically from others in his family. The testimony of Wanda Bishop, a 28-year-old mother of 5 who was separated from her husband and frequently met James Ruppert at her place of employment, the 19th Hole Cocktail Lounge, shed some light on these feelings. Mrs. Bishop told the court about their meeting at the 19th Hole Bar on the evening before the shootings. James Ruppert talked about his financial troubles, his unemployment, and his family. He had a problem which had to be taken care of immediately. His mother had told him that if he could drink 7 days a week, he could help pay the rent. Otherwise, he would have to leave home. Mrs. Bishop testified that James Ruppert left the bar at 11 p.m, only to return later. When she asked whether he had taken care of his problem, he answered, "No, not yet." He stayed at the bar until 2:30 when it closed. Notwithstanding his hostile feelings, James nevertheless depended heavily on his family for both emotional and economic support, and their yearly Easter reunion was special to him. Easter Sunday in 1975 was to be different. Ruppert was on the verge of eviction and his mother had been ill, so his brother's family came late in the day. James had a severe case of the holiday blues. He spent the afternoon asleep in the upstairs bedroom of his mother's house. At 4 p.m, he awoke and went downstairs, where he chatted with his brother about politics and the stock market and watched his nieces and nephews as they gathered Easter eggs. The opportunity was at hand. After spending a few minutes with the family, James said he was going target shooting. He went back upstairs, collected 3 pistols and a rifle, and came back down to the first floor where his family was gathered together. As he walked through the kitchen, still in a state of apparent calm, his brother asked him, with a mocking smile, "How's your Volkswagen, Jimmy?" According to psychiatrists at the trial, James believed his brother had been trying for several months to sabotage his Volkswagen. He was convinced that Leonard had gotten into the crankcase, had purposely destroyed the carburettor and the distributor, had sabotaged the windshield wipers, had loosened the bumper, and had blown holes in the muffler. Thus, Leonard's apparently innocuous question precipitated an entire surge of thoughts, memories, and fantasies about what his brother had done to him since childhood. From James's point of view, Leonard was mocking him about the car, and James reflexively drew his gun. James would see to it that Leonard never again hurt him. He would finally get the better of the brother against whom he had never quite measured up. He would deprive Leonard of life and of the lives of those he loved. And he would make sure that he had enough money to live the life he felt was rightfully his. Finally, on July 23rd, 1982, the now bearded 47-year-old James was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms in prison after being found guilty of murder in the death of his brother and his mother, but not guilty by reason of insanity in the deaths of his 9 other victims. The inheritance was forfeited. James Ruppert remained incarcerated in the Allen Oakwood Correctional Institution in Lima, Ohio, for much of his incarceration. He was granted his first parole board hearing in 1995, but his release was denied, as was his latest attempt at parole in April 2015. His next parole hearing would have been in 2025. On June 4th, 2022, at the age of 88, James Ruppert died from natural causes while incarcerated at the Franklin Medical Center in Columbus, Ohio, a unit of the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction. In the wake of the murders, the 11 victims were buried in the Arlington Memorial Gardens in Cincinnati. A year later, the house on Minot Avenue was opened to the public, and all of the contents were sold at auction. It was cleaned up, carpets were placed over the bloodstains that could not be removed, and it was rented out to a family that was new to the area and had no idea of the horrifying events that occurred there. They very quickly moved out. After leaving the house, they claimed to hear voices and strange noises that they couldn't explain. Lights turned on and off, doors slammed, and thudding footprints were often heard coming down the stairs. They were not the last to move in and quickly leave. A number of other families moved in and out of the house, and none stayed for long. All of them reported sounds and voices that could not be explained. The house was then abandoned for several years, but the last family that moved in reported nothing out of the ordinary. Whatever eerie haunting that had plagued the previous tenants was over at last. Perhaps the echo of the shocking events of 1975, which seemed to leave an indelible mark on the house, had finally faded away, and perhaps, after more than 40 years, the spirits of the Ruppert family can finally rest in peace. Thank you for listening to this episode of Shadow Crimes. If you like this episode, be sure to follow us on social media and check out our website at shadowcrimes.com. You can also listen to this podcast on YouTube, Spotify, Amazon, Apple Podcasts, as well as all other podcast platforms. Be sure to check out our other episodes and stay tuned for new episodes released every Wednesday here on Shadow Crimes, where mysteries thrive and shadows speak.